Welcome to Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. Now entering the grid. Here are your hosts, Thomas and Jeremiah.
That was a crazy race. Welcome to the first ever Turn 1 race recap. We're starting with the 2023 Bahrain Grand Prix. Thomas, so why don't you start us off with how you thought about the race start?
Absolutely. You're right. That was a great way to start the season. We chatted a little bit before we hopped on here, a little bit conservative approach from the drivers. They weren't pushing the limits of the car as much as they could. I think a lot of them were trying to avoid accidents and just trying to get through the end of the race. But with this race recap, we hope to kind of give you a summary of the race, go over some key moments and observations, and just talk about what we saw. So obviously, looking at the starting grid from qualifying, you had a Red Bull lockout of 1 and 2, followed by Ferrari 3 and 4. Then things started to get interesting in that 5 spot to start the race. You had your boy Fernando Alonso coming in 5th in an Aston Martin, which we will talk a lot about.
Aston Martin.
And who did he beat out for qualifying?
A lot of people, first of all, coming in 5th, but how about the whole Mercedes lineup?
The whole Mercedes lineup. You had George and Lewis 6, 7. Followed by Lance Stroll, Esteban Ocon, and Hülkenberg. That rounds out your top 10. A couple of the surprises from qualifying as we entered the race. Obviously, McLaren completely out of the top 10.
See, thoughts on that real quick, because we touched on this in our actual regular weekly podcast, but I told you McLaren did not look good, man. It was scary. I was watching the testing and even in the free practices, and I was just like, oh God, oh no, oh God, oh no.
We had the original hot takes of the year where I said McLaren would be competing down at the bottom with your AlphaTauris and Williams. And then I kind of changed that later to putting them back in their 5 spot. But I think my first prediction was more accurate. And I was wrong about Williams. We'll get into it. After McLaren, Lando Norris, at least, the 2 Alfa Romeos came into the grid at 12-13, followed by Yuki Tsunoda, Alex Albon, and Logan Sargent. So Williams locked up 15 and 16. That is a slight improvement from last year. Followed by the Haas of Kevin Magnussen, Oscar Piastri, Nick De Vries, and then in last, Pierre Gasly. A disappointing qualifying, but not a bad race.
Hey, man, going from 20th to 9th, not that bad.
So we'll get into the logistics or operations of the race as they went down, kind of lap by lap. We'll skip around a little bit, but I wanted to go through some of the biggest movers and shakers of the race, if you will. I took a screenshot of the gained and lost around the 54 lap mark. Fernando Alonso. I was going to say Sergio Alonso. Fernando Alonso gains 2 spots, obviously going from 5 to 3. Huge day for Aston Martin, which I'm sure that'll take a lot of this time. Dropping down, you had a couple other in the top 10 that had single-digit moves. Pierre Gasly jumps 11 spots from 20 to 9 by the end of that race. He also... go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, looking at how Esteban Ocon's race turned out, I was really nervous for Pierre Gasly, and seeing how their qualifying went, I was like, oh no, did Alpine make a giant mistake? because they were riding all high and mighty. They were having a car that was producing well. It was beating out McLaren. They locked in that 4th spot. They had Fernando Alonso and Esteban Ocon. They get rid of Fernando. In comes Pierre, and don't look impressive
at all. Gasly also for a while had the fastest lap, stolen from him at the end by Zhou Guanyu, but for a good bit of the race, he was the fastest lap leader. Here's some other surprising. The Williams, Albon gains 5 places, finishes in the 10 spot. Logan Sargent, the American rookie, gains 4 spots and finishes in 12. What a day.
Yeah, now you got to give a lot of that to the DNFs. Obviously, you have like Charles Leclerc getting knocked out. You have Lando Norris not having the best day. Oscar Piastri getting knocked out. So with all of these places, they're going to boost up a lot higher than what they normally would have been. But that's the name of the game. That's kind of the whole point. We enjoy races where not necessarily people wreck out. We don't necessarily like to see that. But whenever middle of the pack to lower tier teams get a chance to kind of fight for something better than what they normally would have, that's always exciting to watch.
Absolutely. Outside of the three that DNF'd and didn't finish the race, the two biggest kind of losers of the day are going to be Hulkenberg, who lost 6 spots just racing, and then obviously Lando Norris, who had the car troubles the entire race, which I'll touch on more in a second. But your finishing order goes Verstappen, Perez, Alonso, Sainz, Hamilton in the top
Boom.
5, followed by Stroll, Russell, Bottas,
Then your
Gasly,
boy.
Albon. Yeah, so you had obviously Red Bull's lockout 1 and 2. Not a huge surprise. I think there was some competition from Ferrari throughout the race, but they kind of dominated the whole time. The biggest surprise of the day is the Aston Martins taking 3 and 6, without a
Dude,
doubt.
not just Aston Martin taking 3 and 6, but we knew we were going to see something from Fernando Alonso because he has the Fernando Alonso effect, where you go to a middle of the pack team and you outperform the car, and that's something he's done on every single team that he's gone to. But how about Lance Stroll with a broken toe and jacked up wrist, taking that Aston Martin to sixth, man, splitting the Mercedes. They
Yeah,
finished seventh in the constructor standings last year. Seventh.
and he didn't even have the easiest day. He was sliding through turns. His back end was getting loose on him, and he still got that thing up into sixth.
Dude, on the formation lap, I can't remember what the name of the turn is, but the one that's a really, really sharp, where like they kind of have to
10,
start slowing down
10.
and go wide. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So that one, he drives right off the track in the
he did it
formation
3
lap
times
in the
in the
race. But I
race.
mean, like
Yeah,
before the race even started on the formation lap, I was
he's
like,
just drifted.
oh God. Oh God.
Uh, this was supposed to be, and we'll get more into the results as we talk about the race and shake things out. If you're new to F1, which again, this is our second full season watching races, you might be like, well, why aren't they talking about the winner, Max Verstappen, that much? It's kind of how F1 works. There's a lot of
When
these
you're 20
races where
seconds up.
when the leader just takes off and goes, even the cameras don't show him until the last lap.
Dude, so my dad and I were watching the race together. He happened to be joining me while I was doing my race watching, I guess. And when Max finally broke away and he had like even like an 8-second lead early on, they did not show him again until I want to say like lap 57. And it
They showed
showed
his
him
pit
with this
stop.
monstrous lead. They showed his
Yeah,
pit stop. But I had to once I went to his screen and it was like, okay, Max next up is, whoever it was. And then I would go and I'd look over at the little ticker on the left side and I'm go, oh man, he's making his way back through the pack again.
I think he ended up making it up to 12 or 11th when it all ended. Because I noticed him whenever he was passing the Alfa Romeo of maybe Joe,
The first one was
somewhere in there.
by far. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was in like 13th at the time, so I know he made it up a little bit further past that. But that's why we're not really talking about Max winning. It's a big day for him. We'll get to Red Bull in here in a second, but I mean that's just kind of chalk at this point. The bigger movers are the ones in the midfield. This was supposed to be a 2-stop race, and I find this interesting because I remember watching last year all the races. I feel like every time they started a race, they were like, "This is going to be a 1-stop day," and it was never a 1-stop day. This is one of the first times where I've seen the only 2 strategies presented at the beginning of the race be a 2-stop strategy.
Yeah. And we'll get into it more, but I don't think Lando got that message.
No, my only note there was that I think almost everybody else followed that. I know a couple had 3 due to some tech issues. He had at least 5
Yeah.
pit stops.
When I stopped counting, it was at 5. And, it's no fault to his own. Obviously, they had some pneumatic air problems and they had to keep pitting and then refill it with more air to pressurize the system. And I get that. It's not really, like I said, a fault to his own. Why was he still running?
To get time on the track, not experience, but maybe just to see the
Yes.
car in action more, to learn more about the car.
I
It's
get,
not testing, it's a race.
I just feel like if you have a car that's not performing durability wise, then why continue to push it?
Well, Piastri was already out, and so I guess you want to have one car limp across the finish line just to see what it can do. Otherwise, you're giving up a lot of information. Okay, so that's your basic race summary. We had the starting order followed out by where things ended up. not a huge moving day, other than maybe 3 or 4 that gained a significant amount of spots, but the final 5 kind of stays as is, with the exception of Alonso jumping up to third, and definitely cutting out the Ferraris, which had a day. Let's get into more of the, not exactly lap by lap, but let's go chronologically through the race. I'll bring up some key moments, and then Jeremiah will layer in with what he saw. So let's start with lap 1, and specifically turn 1. We go 3 wide into turn 1 off the jump. Why were we going 3 wide off the jump?
So if you looked at the replay, and I actually took some time and went and watched the race restart, or not restart, the race start from every single driver's onboard camera, just so I could see what exactly happened. Perez does not get a good jump. Max,
Horrible.
he gets an okay jump. It's still not good, so he has to go defensive. Max goes all the way to the inside, which means he is dive bombing the corner instead of getting that nice wide apex approach to where you can keep that speed going into the next turn. And he had to do that because Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz destroy that takeoff. I mean, it's lights out and it's go for them. And it's crazy because you watch it. I mean, the second that the race starts, Perez is instantly just coming right at you. And Charles is going around the outside, and Carlos tries to go to the inside and take Sergio. So Sergio starts to go towards the inside and cuts him off. And so you see all these moving parts, all these cars swerving left and right, and you see all the sparks flying because the cars are bottoming out. So if you're watching from like the 5th place view, like I watched Fernando Alonso's view, you just see a bunch of sparks in front of you and just utter madness as they go into these turns.
And they showed at the graphic later on, as they normally do, the reaction time, and Charles had a 1/10 of a second on Max and Sergio's reaction time, which is a lot when you're starting the race.
Yeah, because by the time Charles is up to 50 miles an hour, Max may still be at 35, and the car's accelerating at pretty much the same speeds, but one person starts that acceleration process way sooner than the other.
So we go 3 wide into turn 1. Sergio gets passed by Charles and goes to the 2 spot. So now you have the Ferrari splitting the Red Bull. That did not hold throughout the race, but it did for about 2/3 of it, I'd say.
Yeah,
until it was
and
gained
Sergio
back.
talked a little bit about that too. I don't know if you caught that, but he was talking about how it seemed like every time that he wanted to go for it, the position and the way that he had to go about doing it would have put his tires into like serious degradation. So
Yep.
he thought that he would just lay it out and play the long game, wait for the mistake and take it at that point. So it happened way longer than I think it could have happened, but it was a better overtake because at that point Sergio was then able to hold that spot with his tires that are still relatively fresh.
So there's your top 3 going into the first turn. If you go back to the second 3 in the group, your 4, 5, 6, you had Lance Stroll hit Fernando Alonso.
So I want to get into this. It looks like from what I saw, I didn't really see a fault here between either Aston Martin driver, and I'll explain why. Fernando, when he goes through his turn, he gets past the apex and he's swinging wide. Well, now he's on the outside of the track, but he's got a car right in front of him and he got a better exit. So in order to overtake him, he swings inside. But in doing so, Lance Stroll has a chance to overtake the car in front of him going into the turn. Remember, Fernando's already coming out. So he's going into the turn and he has a chance to overtake. So he dive bombs the corner. Well, in doing that, that's going to put him on the inside of the track, skirting outside because he had to dive bomb that corner. Well, if Fernando's coming inside and Lance is dive bombing inside, he slaps the back of it. It's really I don't want to say any fault of each other. They were both going for the overtake. So I understand the purpose behind both of them. It's just kind of unfortunate to see something like that.
I will say that I kind of, like we talked about when you were saying Lance in turn 10 running off the track, I was highly concerned, I think, for Lance's day, because he struggled in and out of the apex that first lap on almost every turn. And it reminded me of the practices in the qualifying, because in all 3 practices and in the qualifyings, all 3 sessions of that, he struggled in about half the turns on that track.
I was worried whenever I saw him turning, where instead of pulling like that, he would pull, but then push up on this side to make sure that he could get the full rotation. And I was like,
Yeah,
that's not going to look good when you're going to have to do 67 laps.
I just didn't think that he was able to control the car, but he figured it out throughout the course of the race. I mean, still ran off a little bit, but you can't argue with his results. You did have, due to some of the debris that was on the track, a yellow flag on lap 1 in sector 2. It was the tiniest piece of debris I've ever seen. It was like yay big. And even the announcers
Yeah.
and commentators were like, why are we yellow flagging this?
Yeah, maybe not so much a yellow flag that might be dramatic, but again, it's one of those things where if you're going to go over a piece of, let's say, carbon fiber, because I'm not sure what part it was, let's say you're going over a piece of carbon fiber, you don't want to do that at 180 miles an hour.
Every driver ran a pretty conservative race. There were some dive bombing corners, but anytime somebody was getting close or did bump another driver, they immediately backed off and gave it up and just, ceded the position.
Yeah, we saw a lot of that. Kind of to touch on that, going into turn one, when you had the 4 people dogfighting for the top, that's what made Carlos Sainz, I think, fall back. He had Sergio. It should have been Red Bull, Ferrari, Ferrari, Red Bull. But when Sergio started to go towards the inside and kind of push Carlos rather off the track, that's when he kind of hit the brake and said, okay, you know what? It's not worth it on this turn. We'll just fall in line, get our pace going, and then get him in another turn. And I guess I respect that style of driving. It's not as exciting. But what is exciting, though, is whenever you're watching it and it's like, he's like right behind the guy,
Yeah.
centimeters from his gearbox.
Because there was even
my
that time where they were
gosh.
questioning whether two drivers had collided, which they clearly, it was like halfway through the race. They clearly did, but it was so close to them veering off that you weren't quite sure. But no, I don't mind that style. I think it's the first race of the year. Everybody wants to get a full race in, like we were talking about with Lando Norris. You want to get points if you're in a points position, which obviously the Ferraris and Red Bulls were both at the time in good points positions. So I understand it. Okay, so that's lap one. The race did not spread out for a long time. There were some constant little back and forth or pressurings as we go through this. But I did make the note at the start of lap three, Verstappen already had a 2-second lead at the
Yeah.
start of lap three. And I think that has to do with obviously Sergio getting past and their little issues that they were having in the first lap that just allowed him to sail off into clean air. Lap 5, I noted that K Mag dropped to 20 because he was the only driver on hards.
They tried something different. They put Hulkenberg on the softs and Magnussen on the hards. I can see that they were trying to go for, I'm going to say maybe like a hards first and then run a soft. Maybe they
He,
tried the hard soft. I mean, I don't know what their thoughts were at the beginning of the race when it first started, but it
he
was an
gained
interesting
4 spots.
strategy.
He gained 4 spots throughout the race. He
They
finished
did.
in 13th. So that's not bad. But I think in order for them to pull that off, they need to be starting the race in 13th, trying to squeeze in the top 10, not starting at the back. But it worked. I think their strategy worked. Lap 6, now Sergio finally catches up to Charles, and then they kind of hold these positions for a while. I noted that he was within half a second to Charles on lap 6. And then lap 7, I noted that Mercedes was then holding the 5 and 6 spots. I never thought we'd be talking about Aston Martins and Mercedes being the talk of the race, but honestly, that was the battle of the race. And it started right there, kind of lap 6, 7-ish, Aston Martin v Mercedes.
It was awesome to see because when you're talking about a team that finished in 7th position and the Constructors Cup last season, and for this season to be going neck and neck with a team that finished 3rd in the Constructors, and based on, obviously there's a whole lot of races left to go. There's a whole lot of season left to go. But if you had the Constructors Cup end at the end of this race, then you would see Aston Martin and Mercedes like right here with each other. And so you have your Red Bull and your Ferrari. And, right now it might be more like Red Bull and Ferrari, with Red Bull just having a little bit of a lead on them, maybe not necessarily just in strategy, but also in tire degradation and in race pace. But then you're looking at Aston Martin, who obviously isn't neck and neck with Max Verstappen, but if they're duking it out for George and then obviously passing George, working their way towards Lewis, and then eventually passing Lewis, that's exciting for a team that was middle of the pack, man. It shows that with the regulation changes and with that being the cost cap as well, it shows that they actually are doing something. This is the first year, I think, since you and I have been fans, that we have ever seen a middle of the pack team crest from the middle of the pack.
A low end middle of the pack team, like
Right, not
bubble
even like the
bottom
next
team.
in line.
No, like the last in line to be a midfield team. So wrapping up lap 8, and again, we're not going to hit on every lap because some of the laps we know just nothing happens; they just race. But they noted possible damage to Ocon at that point. That's when they noticed his wing was flapping on the side, which they noted Gunther Steiner was going to not like because last year they made the Haas's pit several times for that issue. But then Lewis radios in from his team that he was struggling with tires already. on lap 8, and I was like, Mercedes is in trouble, because one lap later you get the Alonso message, I'm good.
Yeah. Or what about the George message where he's like, is Lewis trying to save his tires or is he struggling? And they're like,
Yeah,
he's struggling.
and he asked to push. He asked for more race pace out of him, which I never heard the response on that. I just heard his ask for more race pace.
Yeah, I think he asked for the pass, but I don't know what came from that. I wasn't listening to
Right.
the onboard camera after that, whenever the announcers cut from it.
Lap 9, quick note. Ferrari says, let's stick to plan A. I think that's the first time I've heard either A, B, or C come out of Ferrari and not G, F, Z, Q, M.
That is so funny you said that. I said the exact same thing to my dad that I was watching the races with. Because I was like, Ferrari plan A. Hold on, it's past lap 6. Typically by now they're on M, N, O, P.
I don't know what the new principal Frederick Vasseur is doing there, but it does seem like, at least in the first race, their strategy was good. I don't have a problem with the Ferrari strategy. We'll get into their reliability issues in a minute. They tried for the undercut about halfway through the race. It didn't work, but they attempted, and I think that's all they could do. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Lap 10, I note that the race has finally fully spread out. And what I mean by that is you no longer have 3 or 4 cars fighting for a position. It is now one-on-one dogfights for individual positions. This is also when you have Alonso really pressuring Russell, is lap 10. He is on his tail, like within 0.3 to 0.5 seconds.
Yeah, he tried to go for a couple overtakes that were a little nasty, and at the last second he pulls out of it, and you're like, "Oh, geez, I thought they were gonna hit." Good Lord.
Yeah, he would do that thing where he'd be running down a DRS straight, and then he would do the quick, go to the right and get on the right tire, and then brake and back off like, I'm right here, just showing. You have larger mirrors now. I know you can see me.
Yeah. No, that was great. That was fun to
Verstappen
watch.
starts locking up on his downshifts. I was worried about that too.
And they had, like I said, I don't know if you paid attention to the interviews afterwards, and more specifically what Max, whenever he was asked about that. It's a minor issue. I mean, we're talking about splitting hairs at this point. They're at a pace that's so much ahead of everybody else, and their durability is so much better than everybody else, that whenever they have the big problem for this week's race, he finishes 30 seconds ahead of everybody else.
Moving on a little bit, lap 11 is when it's noted that Norris has an engine problem, and that never got fixed.
Yeah, I just watched Norris's name go whoop, 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 whoop.
We're not technical experts, but he had a pneumatic air issue with his engine. Basically, the engine has an air supply that they fill up at the start of the race, and it's supposed to go the entire race without needing to be refilled. His had to be refilled 5 times. And that took approximately 5 to 10 seconds every time he was in the pit, on top of his regular pit stop. Lap 12, Ocon noted for improper grid lineup, and lap 12 is where Ocon's downfall started.
What a race for Ocon, man. I like Ocon because he does have like an on-track warrior in him, where he's not necessarily the most outspoken person off the track, and he might not be the person that's the most controversial in terms of being in front of a mic. But on track, he has been shown to have some awesome fights. So for him to just get pegged time after time after time, I was like, oh, God, that hurts.
So he starts with the improper grid lineup, which I've never seen a penalty for that. Last year, I'm sure it happened, but I didn't take note of it. But he gets a 5-second, and we'll just run through Ocon's storyline now. He gets a 5-second grid penalty for improper lining from the grid, goes to the pit to serve his penalty and do a pit stop, right, where you have to wait 5 seconds. Does that wrong, comes out of the box and gets slapped with a 10-second penalty for doing that penalty wrong. And then later on, he's slapped with another 5 or 10-second penalty.
Because when he decided to go in to serve that 10-second penalty, he comes flying into the pits, can't get under the required speed limit by the time that he crossed that line. And so they're like, whoop, another penalty. And it felt like every 3 laps you would see Ocon's name pop up at the top of the screen, and it would be like penalty Ocon or Ocon penalty or whatever it was. And I was just, oh no, another.
It was a bad day for Esteban Ocon, but a relatively good day for his new teammate. Moving on down the order a little bit, lap 13, some things really took off. This was the first of the Alonso and George Russell battles where they went side by side for pretty much an entire sector of the race. Alonso took the inside turn on a couple of those hard rights, forced Russell wide, and then took the 5 spot. George immediately goes into the pits after he lost that battle. I think he burned whatever was left of his tires, which wasn't much for Mercedes at that point.
I think George got a one-on-one lesson in what it means to dog it out. I'm going to be honest. I think with Lewis being as finesse heavy as he is, and with Max being as aggressive as he is, Fernando is like, the way I would describe him is it's like if you took the aggression of Max's driving style but taught it the finesse of Lewis's style and kind of put them together, because he makes educated decisions. In fact, I heard somebody say this. He uses 25% of his brain when he's driving on the actual task of driving, and then the other 75% is just him
everybody else
the entire time. And I'm like, this man is racing other people's races. This is crazy. He was probably planning his overtake for like 4 or 5 turns, or maybe even a couple laps before.
I also think Mercedes has a huge problem with tire degradation because, again, it was called out in lap 8 that they had tire deg. Lap 12, they go to Russell and Hamilton again where they're calling out tire deg. And then lap 13 is where he gets passed and then has to pit. So that might just be a Mercedes getting their car situated before races a little bit better.
Sure.
Lap 14, it's a rough time for the rookie Piastri. They note that he thinks he lost his gearbox. It turns out afterwards, after a little bit of review, his engine just went out.
Dude, I watched his onboard so after I watched the actual race through and through live without any kind of stopping, I went back and I watched it to where I could actually spend some time rewinding and looking at some of these onboards when these people were having their faults. That's how I knew that Lando was having his pneumatic problem and so forth. Oscar Piastri was driving and then his screen just goes black. And then he's trying to downshift and he's having like digital glitches on the screen. He couldn't downshift. There was one point where he was going around turns just in 4th gear and no other gear. He couldn't go down. He couldn't go up. So you would just hear it go just, and he's just stuck at the exact same RPMs the whole time. I felt bad for him, man, because he started off the race immediately with a pass on the start. And he looked to show some promise in a McLaren car that was underperforming. And I wanted to see what he could get out of that car. I wanted to see what Lando or the 2 McLaren drivers who I value as 2 drivers skill-wise, I wanted to see what they could do with this underperforming car. So here again, just like Lando, when I saw Oscar's name just go, whoop, 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 I was like, no, man. I flicked on and I saw the whole glitch and everything with the steering wheel. And I was like, okay, well, that's probably going to be it for him. I doubt that changing the steering wheel is going to fix that.
No, and that's why they thought that would fix it. But somewhere between lap 14 and 15, they pull him into the pit and they fix the steering wheel. And clearly it did not resolve that issue. So they called it a day and they had him sitting out there on the pit for like 40 seconds. So it looked like they were going to send him back out. I think McLaren was saying, whatever happens today, we are finishing this race. That's also the lap where the same time that they note Piastri is officially out of the race is when they officially say Lando has a pneumatic issue with the car and will continuously need to pit to fill up that air supply.
Yeah, and then the second time that Lando finally had to pit, it was one of those, I think the whole, not only just the announcers, but even I was kind of thrown for a loop. I was shocked because when they said that he was probably going to have to pit multiple times to resolve this issue, I was like, okay, pits once, give him about 25 laps, 30 laps, he'll have to come in and pit again. No, it was like 10 laps later. What's up, everybody? This is Jeremiah, co-host of Turn 1. We're going to get right back to this week's episode, but first I want to let you know where you can go to find us. So you can watch our podcast on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok at Turn 1 Podcast. If you want to listen to our podcast, you can listen to it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Amazon Music at Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. If you have any questions, concerns, or suggestions, you can reach out to us at trn1podcast@gmail.com. All right, let's get back to it.
We'll quick hit in a couple of these next laps. Lap 16, Sergio holding a 10-second lead on Verstappen at that point because Verstappen pit. Lap 17, Sergio still running incredibly fast laps on his original softs. That is why he is the Minister of Defense. He is the king of tire degradation. He just doesn't have it.
I love it.
One lap later, lap 17, Bottas up to 6th place. I love seeing Bottas still hanging around the top 10. That's a really good sign. He was getting pressured from Alonso, and then obviously Alonso passes him in the exact same place where he got Russell earlier. A little bit easier to pass the Alfa Romeo than the Mercedes.
Sure.
Lap 19, this is a kind of a key thing, which was make or break for Red Bull in terms of strategy. Both drivers on softs after the first pit stop, after running softs for the first stint of the race. That means, one, they are definitely doing a two-stop strategy. Okay, cool. But that also means you're saving your slowest tire for last. What's the trouble with that?
Safety car, safety car, safety
Yeah.
car, safety car. And it never came. So I feel like maybe they might have lucked out of that. That might be harsh to say, but I don't know. Fernando was looking pretty quick there at the end. It looked like Charles, before his engine failure, was looking pretty quick, and they weren't really getting too much bigger of a gap. So maybe if it's all brought back to a singular file line and a safety car, could have looked a little bit different.
They don't go 1-2 if there's a safety car. They might get one of them, but they don't go 1-2. Okay, moving on down the list a little bit. Lap 21, Sergio and Charles exchanged fastest laps. I thought that was interesting. 18 through 20 are Alpines and McLarens. That hurts. Really hurts for the midfield contenders. Lap 22, you have Sainz gaining on Sergio Perez. That never really played out into anything. They thought it would, didn't. And you had Hamilton gaining on Alonso. That also never really played out into anything. Lap 23, funny note, your boy Fernando Alonso constantly asking about his lap 1 incident and who hit him. And the team's just like, I don't know who hit you. I guess we'll find out at the end of the race. He asked like 4 or 5 times.
Lawrence Stroll's just sitting there. Do not tell him.
He'll quit. He'll leave.
And then it was funny because when they finally did tell them, and I don't know if it was the first time he was made aware of it, but I think it was after he already crossed the finish line, and he was like, oh yeah, I don't care. And then he was like, Lance Stroll is my hero for going through this race with all of the injuries that he was having. And so I don't think, even whenever they were in the cool down room at the very end of the race, you saw the footage of Fernando watching Lance swing in and pop him in the back tire. And I was expecting Fernando to be like, oh my gosh, or something. Nothing. He didn't care. Not a care in the world.
He was very happy. Just like he said towards the end of the race, what a lovely car to drive.
Yeah, what? Meanwhile, the Fernando I know is constantly ripping whatever car that he's driving.
Always, because he's never in the top 3. Moving on down the list, lap 24 and 25, Mercedes 3 times in a row between Hamilton and Russell call out degradation issues over team radio. Aston Martin swiftly takes notes of their issues of tire degradation and proceeds to tell Alonso, keep pushing, they are struggling, which he took full note of and kept going. Lap 27, Hamilton starts questioning his pace. He wants to speed up. The team says, no, your tires are bad. And so he has to hold where he is. Later on, they told him that he could speed up, but for a while there, he was just stuck going slow. I've noted all of Ocon's penalties, so I'm trying to skip through those as we hit them every lap. Hulkenberg takes the fastest lap in lap 29.
Yeah, I was wondering if you were going to mention this because it was just a brief glimpse of excellency. And I was curious if you were just going to just breeze right on past it because of how unnecessary and irrelevant it ended up being, or if you were actually going to give him a little bit of credit, man.
A little bit of credit. He didn't have a good day. He lost 6 spots, but it looked like he was going to have a good day at the start because he was working his way up a little bit. He qualified decently. He got to Q3, right? He was in the top 10.
Yeah, and then in Q3, I don't know if it was just Haas trying to save tires or if he genuinely had some kind of problem, but he didn't even go set a time in Q3, therefore defaulting as P10.
Lap 32, I made an interesting note about the top 10. At this point, also Russell and Stroll are battling, which again makes me lose my mind that George Russell's fighting Lance Stroll. Just never thought I'd see that day come. You have both Aston Martins in the top 7, both Alfa Romeos in the top 10, and your top 4 constructors are Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston Martin, and Alfa Romeo. What a mix-up from the past 6 years of Formula One.
Yeah,
I mean,
and it sucks because part of me, like I said, really wanted to see where McLaren was going to end up if they could have strung everything together. But also, even more than that, I feel like we kind of got cheated from our view of Alpine with Esteban Ocon's penalties and then Pierre Gasly having to start from 20th, especially with him being able to get to ninth. I just want to know what it would have looked like if these guys had started with a relatively decent starting position and just a full race without incidents.
We talk always about how the race kind of straightens itself out after the first couple of laps. Like last year, you would have the Alpines qualify 11 and 12, and then they'd work their way up to 7 and 8, right? But this year, it's the Alfa Romeos and Aston Martins putting themselves in the right place.
I think it's like we touched on this also, and I'm going to kind of reiterate this. I think that Zhou learned a lot in his time with Valtteri Bottas, and I think Valtteri has not slowed down. And in fact, I think with Alfa Romeo being able to give them a car that they can somewhat kind of do something with and not necessarily come in the last position. Oh, 18th, last position, like I saw a lot of improvement in comparison to last year. And with Valtteri being able to finally use his driving skills to put that Alfa Romeo in the top 10. And then we see Zhou, who was in what, like 13th before he tried to pit for the fastest lap.
Yeah, then he finished up in 16th, but he didn't have a bad day. He was always right there on the bubble of 13, 12, 11.
It was great, man.
Yeah, they're improving Alfa Romeo. Lap 36, I made the note that Verstappen had a 38-second lead. Obviously, he was the only one to not pit a second time at that point, but even after he pit, he came back out with the lead. Lap 37 was quite a lap for Fernando Alonso. He gets within half a second of Hamilton, gets DRS, goes wheel to wheel at turn 1 down the first straight, takes the fastest lap, and then he takes Hamilton in turn 3. He was just on a heater that entire day.
This was the first, I feel like the first time as an actual current F1 fan that we got to see the true racecraft of Fernando Alonso, because before he was in those Alpines and he was finishing in, like you said, 7th or 8th, which is great, but he was kind of like they qualified around there and then they stayed right there. They were dogfighting this entire fight, constantly changing positions with different people. And we got to see the different kind of lines that he would take in order to set some of these overtakes up and read them out. I mean, he would go insanely wide over here, but then you'd see George Russell just cruising on by and he would whip it around and they'd get on the throttle at the same time. So then the entire time you're just watching Alonso get closer and closer and closer until he makes the overtake. I mean, it was genius work.
A lot of things were decided between laps 36 and 40. And the reason I say that, one, because Alonso passes Hamilton, then holds that for the race. This is also where Ferrari starts wrapping up their pit stop strategy. Ferrari goes soft, hard, hard. That showed right then and there they were content with where they were in the race and they were looking to defend and not push. Charles at that point was in the 3rd spot and they said, cool, we'll go 3-4 or 3-5, whatever it is. They would have had to go to softs to compete and they didn't. So they said, we're done for the day. Lap 38 is where Alonso started pushing the car and sliding a little bit. He couldn't pull away from Hamilton, but when he did pass Hamilton earlier, he said, yes, let's go. He got all excited.
All of his little nuances whenever he would come on the radio just made me laugh today, man.
He
was having a great time.
He had another quote on lap 45 when he passed Carlos Sainz at that point saying, yes, bye-bye. Flies past him.
Yeah, how about that? How about what you just said? When he passed Carlos Sainz, Fernando Alonso in the Aston Martin, when he passed Carlos Sainz for the 3rd spot.
And it wasn't a difficult pass. He had more pace than Carlos had.
Yes, he was catching him the entire time, caught up to him, and then initiated the pass. Beautiful.
I had you might have mentioned that we said that he was passing Carlos in 3rd, and you're thinking, whoa, where did Charles go? Did he go to 2nd? Nope, Charles is out of the race. He had quote no power in lap 41. He pulls over to the side of the road he pulls over in a very favorable spot to Red Bull because he gave them a virtual safety car and not a real safety car, which again, not that it would have changed much, but boy, if I'm Ferrari, I'm getting on the radio and being like, hey, maybe not park it in that great of a spot.
Maybe park it sideways in the middle of the track. Thanks.
And then get out and run.
Just leave it there.
He parked it in one of the runoff areas that had a gate opening, and the marshals right there, so they didn't have to neutralize the race. Ferrari could improve that, I think, going forward by telling him to stop in a little bit sketchier spot. We mentioned earlier the tipping point for Mercedes kind of getting beat by the Aston Martins was when the tire degradation problems were brought up in the 20 lap range by Hamilton and Russell. Lap 44 is where you see the downfall of the Ferrari that is still on track, Carlos Sainz. He comes on the radio and says, if I push, I might not make it to the end. And right there is green light for Fernando Alonso.
Yeah, if there was two things that were telling more than anything for this race for me, it's that the Ferrari is going to have some durability problems that they have to manage, but even more importantly than that, the Ferrari and the Mercedes have horrible tire degradation, and they're going to have to do some work on that. Because
and I'm
right
sure they
now,
can fix it, but
oh sure,
it's going to take a while.
But right now, Max is running away with it. Sergio will always run away with it because he has mastery of those tires. Aston Martin is running away with it, not necessarily running away as in like they're getting first and blowing Ferrari out of the water, but the fact that the team that we consider to be on equal terms right now with Mercedes is catching up to and passing a Ferrari on one of the last laps, that tells me that they need to figure out how to make those tires last, because maybe not even right off the jump, fine if those softs don't last long, but if you're on hards and you're on the last couple laps, you got to make those stretch. You just have to. I mean, it's prime time, it's peak hours, you've got Fernando behind you chasing you. You have to push, man. I feel like he should have tried to push or something.
Lap 45 was the kind of last action of the race. This was a 57 lap race. Lap 45 is the last place you had action. Here's my notes that I wrote in real time watching this. Alonso instructed to pressure as they know Sainz is struggling. Sainz and Alonso have contact between turn 2 and 4. Turn 8, they're side by side. Turn 10, Alonso takes DRS. Turn 11, bye-bye. And Alonso gets the pass.
And it happened that smooth. That's kind of what we were talking about whenever I was like, it seemed like Fernando would try and go for the attempt, and whenever he saw that it might not have played out as well as it should have, he would bow out. And that's exactly what that was, is, they might have, whether or not they touched, I wasn't 100% sure on that. If you saw that they did, I'm going to roll with that. But contact or no contact, I think that was a lot more conservative than it could be. Like I said, I think he could have tried to get him probably in turn 4.
Sure. And that, again, lap 45 was kind of where the moving stopped. So your final race order, the top 5 goes Verstappen, Perez, Alonso, Sainz, and Hamilton. A few other callouts are Stroll at 6. Gasly takes 9th. Tsunoda takes 11th. So close to getting points for AlphaTauri. And then obviously your 3 DNFs of Ocon, Leclerc, and Piastri, with Lando Norris being essentially a DNF down there in
2 laps down.
17th. 2 laps down and 5 pit stops later.
Yeah. So just to put a little bit of emphasis on just how dramatic this Red Bull was for what I would consider the start of the season in comparisons, you have Max Verstappen beating Sergio, who had to battle with the Ferraris to get that open ground. That opened up and ended up finishing with a basically 12-second gap. It was 11.987. Then you roll into Fernando Alonso, 38.637 behind Sergio, who's 12 seconds behind Max. And at that point, the racers start getting a little bit closer. You have Carlos, who fell to 48 seconds, and then Hamilton to 50. That is a huge, huge gap, man. Yeah. Huge. And I don't know what they're going to do to catch them. I don't know what they're going to do. I really don't.
Ferrari, Mercedes both need some, I don't know if it's upgrades, but they need some car setup figuring out before the next race.
like you said about the Ferrari earlier on, I think they have a really, really fast car. I think that they have to figure out this tire degradation. I thought that they did it nearing the end of the season last year. It's not looking like it, man.
So let's move into some observations. Yeah, let's move into some observations. And this will be, I think, our longest race recap of the season as we finish out our structure and format for how we want to do these. We probably won't go lap by lap on every single race. No. This one was action packed with it being the first one, but let's stick with Ferraris for generic race observations. These are encompassing the whole race. Ferrari still has power and reliability issues. Those have not been fixed from last year. That was pretty apparent with Charles getting out of the race.
Yeah. And I don't know. I was kind of let down, I guess, in terms of Carlos Sainz in comparison to Charles Leclerc, I thought it was going to be a lot closer of a matchup. That's why whenever we did our predictions, I put Carlos over Charles. And it's, round one. There's 22 other rounds before we get to the end of this thing. So there's time to make changes. But I was a little disappointed there.
As you text me, my projections aren't looking so stupid now, are they? And I was like, it's the first race.
Okay, but I feel like, and it might not be as fun on the first round because obviously it's the first round, but I think we need to keep referencing our predictions because as we get to like round 17 and we're talking about our predictions, they're either going to sound absolutely ridiculous or pretty scary spot on, man.
I think we were both off on Alpine and McLaren. Okay, a couple more observations. Oh, go ahead.
Speak for yourself.
Porpoising almost entirely gone with that new rule change, raising the cars 15 millimeters. The only note on porpoising, which I couldn't even see I was watching Carlos after he mentioned that, like lap 45, 46-ish, somewhere in there. He said, hey, why am I bouncing? I was looking at his car, and it wasn't near as apparent as it was last year. Last year, they were violently bouncing.
Right. And I think that's kind of the point, is that while he might still have some porpoising, they've dramatically gotten rid of it. And to his point, I'm going to say the fact that you weren't even able to see it shows just the leaps and bounds that they've taken. So what he was feeling was probably what I would say was a small fraction of what they were feeling during the beginning of 2022.
We talked about this several times throughout the race. Mercedes tire deg, they've got to get that figured out and under control. McLaren has some extreme reliability issues with both cars. So you have Piastri out of the race with an engine electrical problem, something in there that destroyed the steering wheel. And then you have Norris with the air thing, I don't know, pneumatics that they'd keep refilling.
Yeah, if there was a pneumatic leak that was allowing air to unpressurize the system, I believe it's a pressurized system. I could be wrong on this. I believe that's what was going on here. But if you're going to be leaking, that's a mechanical fault all day long. Electrical, like you said, sometimes they can be sporadic. Sometimes they're hard to predict. But a mechanical fault is a mechanical fault, and it just means that something somewhere wasn't built to its certain specifications. Sorry.
I don't know if you want to debate me on this. I said earlier Ferrari's fast, but it's because they had a cleaner race, aside from Charles being out, but more of the race was cleaner than Mercedes. I think if all things go their way, Mercedes has the fastest car on the grid. They were just battling with tire degradation all day. But anytime that they had warmed up their tires, they constantly made up ground on whoever they were fighting. But then the tire would die and they would be out of it again.
And you would see George with the fastest lap.
Yeah. A couple of times you'd see him with the fastest lap. But then again, he only had 4 or 5 good laps on any set of tires.
Yeah, so to that point, I'm going to say by the end of the season, if they can figure out the tire deg, I'm still going to put them number 2 behind Red Bull. I just feel like the pace from that Red Bull is just insane, to the point to where Matt, I don't know if you noticed, Max set the fastest lap one time, which tells me there was only one instance where that man was pushing. In an entire race where he won, there was only one instance where he was pushing.
And won by a lot.
That pace is incredible. And I fear that they've got a long way to go even after they master the tire degradation.
Absolutely. And then the last 2 notes, these are the big hitters that'll take us home and wrap up our Bahrain race recap. The midfield is wide open. Let's talk about the success of Aston Martin first and then move into some of the ones that are moving down. Aston Martin last year finished 7th in the constructors, right? And you had Stroll never really doing anything of significance. And then you had Vettel, who was obviously, that was his retirement year, just kind of coasting his way to the end. I mean, he was still okay, but it was not a top 10 team. It was not top 10 drivers. And then suddenly out of nowhere, you go to Bahrain. They are a top 4, probably a top 3 team.
And you gave me crap for this on our last broadcast.
But, I did.
Well, when you talked about Stroll and how I flip-flopped on him, I'm telling you, it's because before all of this started, before the practice sessions, before qualifying, before the race day, without any of that data, just strictly going off of watching his performances and testing, I saw something in Lance Stroll that I really appreciated, man. I mean, I feel like when you're talking about paid drivers, it's almost as if he's one of the ones that has finally earned his race seat in Formula One. It's like before, obviously, didn't deserve it. Guarantee. Go back and look. You disagree? Go back and look. Now he's finishing 6th, and he's not far off from Fernando Alonso. So you tell me, man.
Well, they mentioned a couple times. Well, I'll make 2 points. One, I think they made a lot of good technical hires because that car is fast, and that car has not been fast
They
before.
hired the number 2 engineer at Red Bull.
Right. And so now they have a fast car, and you give Fernando Alonso a fast car, you're going to see results. And you see Lance Stroll, I mean, just doing well. Like he finished the race, moved up, did great, got 6th.
Haas looked fast at the beginning of 2022 and gradually looked less and less impressive. And my fear is that with this middle of the pack team that's found some incredible race pace and qualifying pace at the beginning of the season, I fear that they won't be able to develop at the same rate as these Red Bull and Ferrari teams. So my biggest concern is, where is Aston Martin going to be when we get to the middle of the break, or middle of the summer break, halfway through the season? What are they going to look like when they come back?
My other point on kind of bagging on your projections, I thought during testing and even the practices that other teams were kind of sandbagging. Like Red Bull clearly was not showing all their cards in testing and practicing. They showed their cards today in the race. But I think Ferrari and Mercedes were showing all their cards, and I just didn't recognize it. I also thought that Aston Martin was seriously pushing in testing and practices, and they might have been, but it still worked on race day. So a great day for Aston Martin. They get a considerable number of points. Stroll collects 8 points and Alonso collects 15 for a total of 23 points for Aston Martin in the first race.
Wow. And how many points, real quick? I just want to do a search. I don't know if you have this information on hand.
How many
points did they get last year? Not even just at the Bahrain Grand Prix, but I mean for a season total.
It might not be 23. While you bring that up, I will bring up the last point, which is the midfield is as wide open as it has ever been. Last year, you saw pretty consistently the battle was between Alpine and McLaren. They were identified as the midfield teams. Everybody above them was dominant. Everybody below them was struggling. This year, the midfield, I will say, is Aston Martin, Alpine, McLaren, and Alfa Romeo. I think you have 4 midfield teams this year.
I agree. I think Alfa Romeo's climbed out of the back markers category and earned their way into the middle of the pack. I can see that.
They're not, AlphaTauri's not there yet. Williams is so close. They're so much better than last year. They're so close. But I think you could see this year a legitimate fight for the 4, 5, and 6 spots in the constructors instead of it just being Alpine and McLaren. And honestly, right now, Alpine and McLaren are at the bottom of that discussion, and Aston Martin and Alfa Romeo are at the top.
It's a funny look, man. But if there was anything that was going to keep an interest level in F1, it's you have teams that weren't anything last year now making their way towards the top of the grid. Like that alone is something that's going to drag so many, not only more fans, but so much more interest and money into this sport.
I'll give us some points totals real quick, and then you can provide any last notes that you have. Obviously, Verstappen wins and takes 25, Sergio 18, Alonso 15, Sainz 12, and Hamilton 10. The fastest lap does die with Zhou Guanyu.
What a move.
Who finishes in 16th and steals that point from Pierre Gasly in the Alpine.
I love
your constructors standings right now: Red Bull 1 at 43 points. Aston Martin 2. Aston Martin 2 at 23 points. Mercedes 3, 16. Ferrari at 4th place with 12 points. Alfa Romeo 5th at 4 points. What a race.
Yeah, and that's a great way to start the season. That's exactly the kind of thing that we wanted to see. Here's my stat for the day for you. You said Aston Martin sitting at how many points?
23.
They finished last season with 55 points.
And they've got half of it in race 1.
They're almost halfway to their total points for all of last season.
In one race.
Wow.
And there's more races this year. And I would bet they didn't get a podium last year.
You know what? I tried to get on the wagon before the race started, so that I tried to make it evidently clear that I am a Fernando Alonso fan and I'm loving what I'm seeing from the Aston Martin team. I tried to make that evidently clear before the race started. So when I make my presence known as a full-on Aston Martin bandwagoner, I don't want to hear anything. I made my point before round one.
He's gonna have the Cognizant polo on next week and
be rocking green everything, just the green hat, the green polo, and
the Fernando Alonso Kamoa hat.
All right.
All right, that is all that I've got for the first race, man.
What an amazing episode. What an amazing race. Can't wait to do more of these. These are fun, man. These are a lot of fun. I'm liking this.
All right, guys, we will be back on Friday with our regularly scheduled episode, and then again the rest of the season on Mondays after each race weekend.
Yeah, we hope that you guys enjoyed this week's episode, and we hope that you're going to enjoy next episode as we go to round 2 of the 2023 Formula One season.
All right, thanks, guys.
Bye, guys.